Thank you so much.
All right, hello everybody. I sure wish we could all be meeting in person. This is actually the first Arkansas Stories program that we've done in a virtual environment. But I think this has become our new normal this academic year. I'm Kathy Sloan. I'm one of the team members of the Arkansas Stories Project. It started out as a Chancellor's Collaboration and Innovation Grant funded by Chancellor Joe Steinmetz in his office at the University of Arkansas. We are a group of humanities specialists, and I'm going to introduce, well, not introduce everybody, but put their names up on a slide in a second. But I would like to show you the website graphic for your, I hope you can see that because it's no longer on there. It's on my screen now. There is the website address. We're having a little bit of difficulties, I've heard, in that some of the interactivity of the website aren't currently working, but they should be soon. It was transferred from one URL to another. But I do want to give a shout out at the beginning to Red Rooster Design, who worked with Mike Pierce and his team to develop the website, do the beautiful graphics, as you'll see when you enter the website and read some of the documents and look at the materials. So a shout out to Allie and Brad. I don't know if they're with us today, but Red Rooster Design in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I want to talk a little bit about the project and also share a list of the team members, because we are a group of humanities specialists across several colleges at the university, colleges and departments. Let me get this live here for you. So as you can see, we are quite a diverse group in the terms of the departments that we come from, and also the disciplines and the things that we study, but we all have a passion for humanities, and especially public humanities. I mean, this is a project that uses an object or a place or a person to kind of nuance what we understand about our own heritage as Arkansans or adopted Arkansans, but certainly US and international history as well. Each team has worked on a particular topic, a particular object or place, and kind of nuance the story. Stories that we don't hear much in the traditional record, or at the very least, we're kind of expanding that historical record to give voice to more actors like Nelson Hackett that we haven't heard from before. You'll see that we've done a few programs so far. This is our fourth one today. We've had 3 previously. You can see the subjects range from looking at a Cherokee Confederate, but going into Elias Cornelius Boudinot and his kind of connections to Fayetteville and the wider region through his bookcase. His bookcase, which you can see in special collections in Mullins Library, as well as the reading materials in that bookcase. We then moved on to a program at Spiral Mounds in Oklahoma. And this is where we involved the Tesseract Center on an archaeological survey on producing kind of a virtual environment to look at sacred objects in a ceremony that occurred to renew the world in the midst of climate change. And then also Arkansas Stories of Captivity and Resistance. Many of us are, as Arkansans or as adopted Arkansans, are aware of the Japanese internment camps in the state, but we also explored the captured Italian soldiers and German soldiers that were at Monticello and McGee in Arkansas. So we've partnered with community stakeholders, scholar experts from other parts of the state, as well as University of Arkansas personnel, to tell these kind of compelling stories that make our state unique and very interesting, but also make our state's connection to the rest of the world and the nation. And so I'd like to say, drum roll please, let's move on to the Nelson Hackett Project. And I'd like to introduce the team lead, my colleague in the history department, Michael Pierce, who's an associate professor of US history who specializes in labor. He's the author of a book entitled Striking with the Ballot, Ohio Labor and the Populist Party. He received his PhD at The Ohio State University, and he's currently working on a book that looks at race and labor in Arkansas with a working title of The Making of Walmart America, The Rise and Fall of New Deal Liberalism in Arkansas, 1941 to 1992. So Mike, take it away, please.
Hi, everyone. I am Michael Pierce. I was the lead on creating the Nelson Hackett Project. And Nelson Hackett, for those of you who don't know, was an enslaved man in Fayetteville who in 1841 fled. He makes his way up to Canada and is the first and only enslaved person that is returned to the United States, that the Canadians returned to the United States. But and his return, though, helped secure, put into play forces that would make sure that Canada would remain a safe haven for American slaves. And so what I'm going to do today is give you a quick, I'm sorry, I am in the wrong place. Let me share my screen. What I'm doing is I need to give, okay. So the website that we have, we created a website to document Nelson Hackett's flight. And what the website does is it traces Nelson Hackett's flight as he moves from place to place, as he leaves Fayetteville, moves across Missouri into the free states of the North and look into Canada. And so what you can do is hopefully you can click on the link and follow along this talk. For those who can't do that, you can just follow along the PowerPoint. We don't know much about Nelson Hackett until he escapes. He escapes sometime in the middle of July 1841. There's various versions of his escape. What they do, what we do know is that when Hackett left Arkansas, or he left Fayetteville, he took one of his master's horses, a saddle, a gold watch, a chain, a beaver coat, and about $500 in coin. And he makes his way out of Fayetteville. After he leaves, only after he leaves does he enter the historical record. After he leaves, 2 bills of sale are registered in the Washington County Courthouse here in Fayetteville. And what these bills of sale do is they document earlier sales, the earlier sales of Nelson Hackett. One, in 1840, Jacob Cartwright sells Nelson Hackett to a guy named Willis Wallace. And then Willis Wallace sells Nelson Hackett to his brother, Alfred Wallace. These documents are the first time that, and you can see one of them on the right, these documents are the first time that Nelson Hackett appears in the historical record. The people of Fayetteville only know him as Nelson. And so how and when he adopts the last name Hackett, we have no idea. And that will remain really a mystery until more information is found. And Hackett leaves Arkansas and he goes about 360 miles across the state of Missouri. And he goes 360 miles through slave territory, through a slave state. This is an amazing journey. Most fugitives from slavery depart from the border states. They have a much shorter journey. And to put this in perspective, 360 miles is about this distance from Birmingham, Alabama to Louisville. And so this is a kind of an amazing journey, but we don't really know much about it because Hackett never talked about it. In fact, Hackett rarely, his voice is never recorded. There's one deposition that he could be his words, but we don't know. And so when we're reconstructing his life and his journey, we're using the words and the ideas of other people. And this process makes Hackett into an object. rather than the subject of his own story. And it robs him a little bit of his humanity. And so in order to understand Hackett, the person, we have to look at his actions rather than what people are saying about him. And we do know that when Hackett fled across the state of Missouri, he went straight to a town called Marion City. And Marion City is on the Mississippi River. It is 100 and some miles north of St. Louis on the Mississippi. And Hackett went there on purpose because it was an abolitionist hub. Starting in the mid 1830s, an abolitionist, a white abolitionist from Tennessee, moved there and became a minister in a Presbyterian church. And he starts preaching a gospel of abolition. He starts something called the Mission Institute, which is a learning center for abolitionists. David Nelson and his crew get run out of Missouri and they go across the river to Quincy. But in Quincy, Illinois, the Mission Institute continues to work. And what it does is it runs an underground operation ferrying fugitives across the Mississippi River. And Quincy, Illinois, where we know Hackett crosses here. And we're fairly sure that after crossing the Mississippi River, he gets hooked up with the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad in Quincy started about 4 blocks from the Mississippi River at a house over here, this guy named Richard Eels. And he was the sort of the beginning of the Underground Railroad in Quincy. And so the Underground Railroad is this guides, safe houses, barns that guide fugitives across the free states toward Canada. And so we don't know the exact route that Nelson Hackett took from Quincy to the town of Chatham. And Chatham is in Canada West. And Chatham is, it was in the 1840s and 1850s, it was considered to be Canada's Black Mecca. It was a town of about 600 people, and about 250 of them were African, were Black. Many of them African-American fugitives from slavery in Kentucky. And in Chatham, there's also a lot of white animosity toward these fugitives. White Canadians oftentimes shared the same type of prejudices that were found in the North. And so there was a movement in Canada to prevent, a movement among whites in Canada to prevent too many fugitives from moving in, from crowding in. But Hackett arrives in Chatham, about 50 miles east of Detroit in early September. Alfred Wallace, the man who claimed to own Hackett, had put a man on his trail, found out where Hackett was going, and went straight from Fayetteville to Canada West. And on September 6th, 1841, Alfred Wallace arrives in Chatham, and the next day he has Nelson Hackett arrested on charges of theft. He says, look, that saddle, that horse, that gold watch, that chain, all of that money, the fur, the beaver coat, he stole that from me. And what the authorities in Chatham, the white authorities don't want thieves to be around. So they arrest Hackett. They beat him, they get a confession, and they move him 50 miles east to a place called Sandwich, right across the river from Detroit. And Hackett is put in the jail there to await extradition to Arkansas. The problem is there's no extradition treaty between the United States government and the British government that controls Canada. And so there's this huge debate in Canada among the authorities about whether to honor the extradition request for Nelson Hackett. And it came from the governor of Arkansas, a guy named Archibald Yale. And Archibald Yell demanded the return of Nelson Hackett, a fugitive from Arkansas who was wanted for theft. It takes a while for the Canadian government that they have committees look into it, but finally in February of 1842, the governor of Canada, Sir Charles Bagot, decided that Hackett must be returned to Arkansas. And what Bagot said was this. He said, Hackett is obviously guilty of stealing those things. And two, Canada cannot become an asylum for people like Nelson Hackett, who are felons. And so Bagot orders the Canadian government, the Canadian officials, to hand over Nelson Hackett to agents of the state of Arkansas. And on the night of February 8th, 1842, an agent of the state of Arkansas, a guy named Lewis Davenport, goes to Sandwich. He blindfolds, he ties up Nelson Hackett and transports him across the Detroit River and puts him in the Detroit jail. This act aroused the Black community in Detroit, about 200 people in a town of about 10,000. And the Black community in Detroit revitalizes the Colored Vigilant Committee. It's sort of informal leadership. And the Colored Vigilant Committee investigates the return of Nelson Hackett to the United States. And they are absolutely shocked. And they said, look, the reason Nelson Hackett was returned, the reason that the governor of Arkansas wanted Nelson Hackett returned was not because of theft. They said the real crime of Nelson Hackett was that he absconded from slavery. He was a fugitive. And so he's being punished not because of for theft, but because he's a fugitive. And then the Colored Vigilant Committee said this. It said, if Nelson Hackett's return to the United States is allowed to stand, that other slavers will make charges of theft, make them up out of thin air, in order to reclaim fugitives living in Canada. And what the Colored Vigilant Committee said is, if Hackett's extradition is allowed to set a precedent, Canada will no longer be a safe place for American fugitives. And those already in Canada will not be safe. And what the Colored Vigilant Committee does is it activates a transnational abolitionist community to fight for, to prevent Hackett's return to Arkansas. And so abolitionists in London and in Liverpool and in Boston and in New York City and throughout Canada start working. They start writing letters and sending petitions. Unfortunately, once the governor of Canada sent Hackett back over to Detroit, Hackett's fate was almost sealed. And Hackett stayed in Detroit until early April. They had to wait for the ice on the upper Great Lakes to clear before coming back to Fayetteville. And in April of 1842, two captors, Lewis Davenport and a man from Fayetteville, take Nelson Hackett from Detroit back to Fayetteville. Steamers along the Great Lakes, staged from Chicago to Peoria. Hackett actually escapes for 2 nights in the town of Princeton, Illinois, but we don't have time for that now. From Peoria to St. Louis on a steamboat. We're not clear how Hackett goes from St. Louis to Fayetteville, either steamboat down the Arkansas, down the Mississippi, up the Arkansas to Van Buren, then over the Boston Mountains, or just a land route via Springfield, Missouri. But Hackett comes back to Arkansas, to Fayetteville in the summer of 1842, and he is beaten. There are one account says he's beaten 6 times, as many as 125 lashes per beating. He's put on trial, and Lisa Childs, who's talking next, has found the transcript of that trial, and we'll be talking about it. But also, what the court in Arkansas does is returns Nelson Hackett to Wallace. And this is controversial, especially in Canadian and British circles. They say that once Hackett had stepped foot on Canada, he was a free man, and he could be punished for the crime of theft, but he could not be re-enslaved. And so this causes all sorts of uproar in Canadian and British abolitionist circles. But Wallace promptly sells Hackett to someone in Texas, the Republic of Texas. But here's the thing. After Wallace sells Hackett to someone in Texas, Hackett escapes a 3rd time. And we know this because the congressman from Arkansas, a guy named Edward Cross, tells it to Joshua Leavitt, a prominent abolitionist. And that is the clipping that you have right here. And what Joshua Leavitt writes is Hackett has escaped a 3rd time and has not been heard of since. We don't know what Nelson Hackett's fate was. This is the last we hear of him. But what we do know is that abolitionists throughout the Atlantic world are bound and determined to make sure that Nelson Hackett is the last fugitive from slavery that Canada returns to the United States. They want to use the case of Nelson Hackett to make sure that Canada will remain a haven for fugitives from American slavery. And they get this opportunity almost immediately. In August of 1842, the United States and Great Britain signed what is known as the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And the Webster-Ashburton Treaty is about, it settles a bunch of disputes between the United States and British North America over boundaries, Great Lakes trade, other things. But in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, there is an extradition provision, Article 10. First time there's an extradition provision between Canada and the United States. And what Article 10 basically does is it codifies the procedures that were used to extradite Hackett back to the United States. Article 10 promises that Hackett's extradition will just be the first of many. And what this does, once the Webster-Ashburton Treaty is made known, abolitionists throughout the Atlantic world, white and black, British, Canadian, American, start going to work to get Article 10 modified or changed or thrown out. And this starts even before Ashburton leaves Washington, D.C., where they negotiated the treaty to go back home. Lewis Tappan and Garrett Smith visit, 2 prominent American abolitionists visit Lord Ashburton in DC. And they say to Ashburton, what about Nelson Hackett? Look at the Nelson Hackett case. Nelson Hackett, Nelson Hackett, Nelson Hackett. And Nelson Hackett becomes the center of their argument against ratification of Article 10. And what Lord Ashburton did is he gave Lewis Tappan and Garrett Smith some assurances. He says, the British government remains committed to the abolition of slavery. We'll make sure that this is not abused. And Tappan and Garrett Smith got as much as they could have hoped, but they knew that only British subjects could really pressure the British government to somehow change Article 10, the extradition procedure. And so when Parliament starts debating Article 10, the abolitionists are there making argument. the guy on the right that you see, his name is Thomas Clarkson. He is arguably the most influential of British abolitionists. He's right up there with Wilberforce, his sometimes partner, sometimes adversary. And Clarkson and other Anglo Canadian British abolitionists start making arguments to get rid of Article 10. And at the center of these arguments is Nelson Hackett. They say Nelson Hackett's example will teach slaveholders throughout the South that all they have to do is make charges of theft to reclaim enslaved people who had escaped. These abolitionists also make other arguments that slaves are legally chattel, property, and that property, unlike human beings, cannot be held responsible for crimes. And in the words of one of them, you can't hold a cow responsible for trespassing. You can't prosecute a cow, therefore you cannot prosecute other chattel like slaves. If you're going to say slaves are legally property, you have to treat them as property in the court systems. And lastly, they said there are no fair trials for enslaved people. And they again pointed at Nelson Hackett's case. They didn't think Nelson Hackett received a trial in Arkansas. He did, Lisa Childs will talk about that. But as Parliament debated this, it first went to the House of Lords. And the House of Lords, Lord Stanley, the colonial secretary, gave more and more assurances. He says, we will not accept extradition requests from states, only the national government. In the House of Commons, more assurances were issued. Robert Peel, the prime minister, said, if this proves to be harmful to African Americans, fugitives, England will abrogate it. He also said that procedures will be put into place to protect those fleeing slavery. And so Parliament doesn't amend Article 10. And the reason why is they're quite fearful if the English reject Article 10, that the US Senate will reject all of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty and all of the problems associated that will come back. So what England does is it accepts Article 10 and then puts so many conditions on the return of fugitives as to render it difficult to enforce. After Parliament ratifies Article 10, the Colonial Office sends instructions to Canada and to the Bahamas, basically saying you have to be absolutely certain of the guilt of fugitives, and you have to be absolutely certain of the fairness of their trials, and you have to be absolutely certain that what they're being accused of in the United States is actually a crime in British territories. Once these instructions are issued, many of the abolitionists start celebrating, and they start thinking that Article 10 will never be used to have another case of a Nelson Hackett. But they were not satisfied until 1843, when a fugitive from the Bahamas, a fugitive from Florida, he kills his owner while escaping and makes his way to the Bahamas. And while he's in the Bahamas, the state of Florida extradites him and cites Article 10. Colonial officials in the Bahamas reject this request. And in part because they say escaping someone trying to enslave you and killing them is self-defense, and that's not a crime in the Bahamas or the British area. And so here's a case where a fugitive who killed his owner is not extradited. And after this, the abolitionists declare Article 10 to be dead, that it will no be used to extradite any fugitives from Canada or the Bahamas back to slavery in the United States. And these abolitionists said that the reason this happened is because of the pressure that the abolitionists had put on the House of Commons, the House of Lords, on Lord Ashburton. And this pressure, Nelson Hackett was at the center of this pressure. And so Nelson Hackett puts into motion the events that make sure that that Canada and the Bahamas remain safe haven for American fugitives. And the question is, now, what does all of this mean? What does it matter? One, it is a reminder to the people in Fayetteville and Northwest Arkansas that slavery in Northwest Arkansas was not benign. We like to tell ourselves that slavery in the Ozarks was different than slavery in the Delta, but that, yes, it is different, but that does not mean it was not violent, it was not nasty, it was not punitive. It was a horrific institution. But the other thing we have to think about is this is a man, an enslaved man, who in 1841 leaves Fayetteville and through his own agency puts into motion huge changes that help make sure that Canada remains a haven for fugitives from American slavery. And these fugitives in the 1840s and in the 1850s will be one of the driving forces in the sectional crisis. Fugitive slaves and slavery in the West, those are the two things that drove the sectional crisis and led to the ultimate abolition of slavery in the United States. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy, and she'll introduce the next person. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So any students out there that haven't declared humanities or history as a major, come on, it's so cool. Who gets to work on these types of documents and piece these stories together? Our next speaker is a student, by the way, but she is a very interesting graduate student in the history department. Her name is Lisa Childs, and she has a day job as a patent attorney for the UA, University of Arkansas System, Division of Agriculture. Her PhD is in genetics, and she's also a 7th generation Arkansan. Welcome, Dr. Childs.
I'm trying. Okay, is my video on and am I live?
Yep, you are live and go.
Thank you. The scene has changed dramatically. So tonight, my task is to contextualize the white guys in Fayetteville who were involved with Nelson Hackett. You're going to hear a slightly different perspective from what Mike Pierce has to say about them. I'm going to situate them in their time and place. The takeaway is that the white guys were rich. They were related to each other. They were in business together. They were killers. They were fraudsters. They were looking for the next big thing. Start by looking at Fayetteville and its surroundings. In 1840, 41, 42, when all this happened, Arkansas was a new state. Washington County was a new county. Fayetteville was a new town. White people were dealing in property even before land was available from the federal government. The first entries in the Washington County property books were transferring ownership of other people. This slide shows the first owners of the 36 square miles around Fayetteville, with the orange color representing landowners who also had enslaved people in their household in 1840. To orient you, US 71B runs through the middle of the map. I-49 is off to the west, crossover to the east. That black square is the original town, including the Fayetteville Square. You can see a lot of people owned both lands and slaves in Fayetteville's earliest days. But if you look at this next slide, which is the original town plat of Fayetteville, again with the first landowners who also had enslaved people in their households shaded in. You can see about a quarter of the Fayetteville households in 1840 included enslaved people. This turns out to be double the percentage in the county. Fayetteville was where you went in Washington County if you wanted to get rich, whether by land or slaves or otherwise. The orange lots are owned by men who were directly connected to Hacket. The blue lots are owned by other slaveholders. This orange sliver just to the west of the square is Alfred Wallace's store, which he sold to W.L. Wilson. Wallace also owned the rest of the corner of Block and Center, where the Bank of Fayetteville is now. He also owned Nelson Hackett. In this slide, we're looking at data from the 1840 federal census for Fayetteville. White men and women are sorted by their ages on top, Black enslaved men and women by their ages on the bottom. You can see there are considerably more enslaved women, young enslaved women, and somewhat older white men, suggesting that the enslaved women were brought here for purposes of growing the white guys' estates, literally. The first documentary evidence of Nelson Hackett is in this same 1840 census. He's probably the enslaved Black man in the Jacob Cartwright household in Fayetteville. The next documentary evidence are the two transfers of title Dr. Pierce mentioned. They were recorded in July 1841, about a week after the Wallaces claimed they discovered he'd gone. But the transfers were made a year earlier, allegedly, when Jacob and his wife Jane Leeper Cartwright sold Nelson Hackett to Willis Wallace in exchange for another Black man named Moses and a mule. A day or so later, Willis sold Nelson Hackett to his brother Alfred for $1,000. Hackett later testified that the second transfer didn't happen until December 1840. You'll see the witnesses on these deeds are Alfred Wallace, Willis Wallace, Augustus J. Ward, and Onesimus Evans. All but Willis accused Nelson Hackett of stealing from them on his way north. And of course, Willis was his owner. The last clear traces of Nelson Hackett were in late 1842. After he was convicted of larceny, the prosecuting attorney here announced he was no longer pursuing the case, and the judge freed Hackett. A bit after that, Congressman Edward Cross reported that Hackett had escaped a third time. After that, we're left with rumors and guesses. What were the white guys doing in Fayetteville? Who were they? Why did they care so much what happened to Nelson Hackett? Northwest Arkansas was an area pegged as the next big thing. Statehood, Indians moving nearby, government contracts, presidential appointments. In fact, most of the white guys in this story had federal government appointments and political aspirations. They were violent, horrible people as well. This illustrates the things that Alfred Wallace claimed Nelson Hackett took when he caught up with him in Canada. Wallace's beaver coat and racehorse, a fine quilted saddle, a gold watch, and perhaps $500 in hard cash. He also claimed that Nelson Hackett raped his daughters. His daughters were toddlers, and that charge was never repeated. They claimed he took Alfred Wallace's coat and racehorse on July 2, along with W.L. Wilson's fine quilted saddle. 2 weeks later, he went upstairs in Onesimus Evans' two-story house to take A.J. Ward's gold watch. Where was he in that 2 weeks? I think he was, for some of that time, traveling back to Fayetteville from a horse race. They claimed he took 100 or maybe 500, the story changes, dollars of Mexican silver and American gold, probably from the Fayetteville branch of the Bank of Arkansas. After all, like Willie Sutton says, you rob banks because that's where the money is. George Gregg and Onesimus Evans went with Alfred and Willis Wallace to Canada to see about getting Nelson Hackett back to the United States. As you heard, Governor Yell signed the extradition papers. Remember my topic. Who are these white guys? Why did Nelson Hackett take stuff from them? Turns out they're part of a kinship network and a financial network. These were not random white guys. Alfred Wallace was related to most of them and in business with them too. Alfred Wallace's wife was sister to A.J. Ward's wife, the Howell sisters. Alfred and Willis Wallace's sister was Onesimus Evans' wife. Onesimus Evans' niece married George Gregg. W.L. Wilson's niece married McKay Ball. Wallace and his brothers-in-law Ward and Evans were in business together as merchants. Willis bought Alfred Wallace's Fayetteville store when Alfred moved to Van Buren. Wilson's brothers were steamboat captains, likely responsible for supplying these merchants with goods. There were military connections too. Howell and Evans and Wilson's brother and George Gregg were all elected officials and the officers in the Arkansas militia. These guys were already wealthy when they came to Arkansas. In 1828, back in Tennessee, Bill Wallace, who's the daddy, sold 24 of his enslaved people to 2 of his children. They socialized in expensive ways. Another Wallace brother, Leonard, ran a race course in Fayetteville. Alfred Wallace and McKay Ball and W.L. Wilson hosted balls. These men were violent. Willis Wallace had already killed 2 men in the last year, one in what was remembered as a drunken brawl. Some claim he killed the other man over a card game, but they were also in court fighting over money. Willis got off both times. Ball fought more than one duel. Several of these men were convicted of assault and battery. Not Alfred, though. A contemporary of Alfred said his inordinate acquisitiveness made him less dreaded than his brothers. These are portraits, though, of Onesimus Evans and his wife, Eliza Wallace. She was dark and beautiful as a summer night, but she was the wife of a cold, formal religionist of the Baptist persuasion. That would be Onesimus. Ironically, the biblical Onesimus was a runaway slave. And these are the Wilson brothers. The fact that I've found portraits of 5 of these people is another sign of how wealthy they were. W.L. Wilson is on the left. His niece, Rebecca's husband, was McKay Ball, the cashier. The Wilsons, like Ball, were out to make a buck. W.L.'s brothers ran steamboats in a time when steamboats were expanding as quickly as possible, running as fast as possible, to make as much money as possible. In fact, Rebecca's father died in a steamboat accident. The Fayetteville branch of the State Bank was a 2-story building on East Center Street, just off the square. The bank bought it for $7,500. It sold for 10% of that less than 10 years later. McKay Ball was the cashier. W.L. Wilson was the president. Onesimus Evans and Alfred and Willis Wallace were all officers in the bank. And at just about the moment Nelson Hackett went north, David Walker was auditing the Fayetteville branch, and there was some funny business. For instance, Alfred Wallace had cut a deal where he was loaned a good chunk of money, $10,000, at 2.5% interest, and the bank forgot to put the loan on the books for 6 months until the interest rate had nearly doubled. David Walker started the audit in May, only to find the books missing. They showed up later, but they were missing all the important bits, like where the money went. In 1906, a banking historian described these folks as showing the want of high business integrity, which men in banking circles should possess. In late summer of 41, McKay Ball went to Texas under a cloud. At about the same time, Hackett went to Canada. And why were these white guys so interested in getting Nelson Hackett back? I am not sure. Maybe they wanted to distract from the bank business, which was not going well. Maybe Nelson Hackett was an excellent horse racer, or their feelings were hurt. Maybe they were mad he'd gotten away and they wanted a road trip. There was a strong feeling at the time that allowing enslaved people to run off would just encourage others to follow. What we shouldn't do, though, is put it down to boys will be boys. Of course, that usually means white guys gonna white. These were men. George Gregg was the youngest at 22. The rest were in their 30s. Actually, McKay Ball was 47 years old when he did this. Nelson Hackett, as I said, left for Canada at almost the same time the bank audit hit the papers. In summer 1841, Alfred Wallace and Nelson Hackett went to a race. We don't know what race or even what state, but there was a race at Arkansas Post in late June. Hackett testified that he took the mare from the racetrack field. Perhaps he was sent home with a racehorse. An abolitionist reported after interviewing him that finding himself well-mounted under circumstances that permitted absence, he directed his course toward liberty. Alfred Wallace testified that he never left Hackett alone for more than 3 or 4 weeks at a time. Maybe he had sent Hackett home with a horse before. So we could guess that maybe Hackett reached Fayetteville on July 2nd and left Fayetteville a couple of weeks later when he heard rumors of the bank audit's results and guessed that the Wallaces might be distracted. On July 21, Walker's audit hit the papers, and Governor Archibald Yell, who was also from Fayetteville, was pretty mad. He threatened to appeal to the judicial tribunals to prevent further loss by mismanagement. At some point, Alfred Wallace came home only to find Nelson Hackett gone. A week later, Wallace recorded the deeds of sale to put title to Nelson Hackett in his name. And the Wallaces got together a posse to go after Nelson Hackett. Now there's a puzzle. How did they know he'd gone for good? How did they know he'd gone north and not south? How did they find him so quickly in the days before the telegraph? Did they go by steamer while he went by foot? Did the Wilsons help find him? I don't know. But in that posse were Alfred and Willis Wallace and Onesimus Evans and George Gregg. Nelson Hackett got to Canada September 1, 6 weeks after he took Evans' watch. The posse reached Ontario 1 week later. They found Hackett with the horse, the overcoat, the saddle, and the watch, but not the money. By September 18, they had pulled in the acting governor of Michigan to demand Hackett's return to the United States. But they hit a stump. Canadian authorities required the state of Arkansas to indict Nelson Hackett. Back in Arkansas, Ball had come back from Texas that fall. He was in something of a fix because he owed a lot of money to a lot of people. He spent 2 months liquidating his assets, and he made sure to pay off connected people first. He left Wilson to pay off what he could with Ball's debts with what was left over. David Walker was especially mad at Ball. He published a letter saying basically, hey, you've been back 2 months. All you've done is complain about me. I offered to meet you and go over the books in front of near 300 respectable citizens. And what did you do? You made a personal attack on me to divert public attention from the points at issue. But I'm on to you. At the same time, on November 26, 1841, the grand jury in Arkansas indicted Nelson Hackett for 2 things: Wilson's saddle, Ward's gold watch. They ignored Wallace's horse and coat and the allegedly missing cash. And of course, we never heard about the rape again. 4 days later, Governor Yell wrote the Canadian authorities demanding Nelson Hackett. As you heard from Mike Pierce, Nelson Hackett was taken from Ontario and kept at Detroit until the ice thawed on the Great Lakes in spring of '42, when Onesimus Evans showed up to take him back to Arkansas. But meanwhile, there was a lot of moving going on. In March of '42, Alfred Wallace sold his store on the square to Wilson. He headed to Van Buren. In late July, another report on the Fayetteville branch of the state bank came out. It called it a shocking expose of fraud and embezzlement. And a whole mess of people went to Texas. Now, going to Texas was going to another country. Remember that Texas was its own republic from 1856 until 36 till 1845. And many of these characters did go to Texas. Willis and Riley and their sister, 3 of the Wallace siblings went there. Willis, Riley, their sister Eliza, her husband Onesimus Evans, their father Bill was buying land there. McKay Ball was there. Alfred bought land in Texas, though he didn't move. But the trial of Nelson Hackett went on. By early August 1842, he was in the Washington County Jail awaiting trial. 2 other men were in jail with him. And on August 4, Judge Hogue called a special session of the circuit court to start August 17. Nelson Hackett was apparently added as an afterthought, judging by the court records. The first 2 cases were dealt with on August 17. Nelson Hackett's trial was called on August 18. He was charged with larceny. He pled not guilty and asked for a trial by jury. And the jury found him guilty. It's a bit odd here, actually. The mandatory sentence for enslaved people convicted of larceny was no more than 39 lashes and not less than 1 hour in the pillory. The jury assessed his punishment to 20 lashes and to stand in the pillory 1/2 hour. Now note, if he had been convicted of larceny of the horse, the penalties drastically increased. But the judge affirmed the sentence and adjourned till the next morning. Keep in mind, nobody's left in jail. The special session called for just these 3 cases. This suggests, at least in hindsight, there was something more going on. The next day, Friday, August 19, court did reconvene. The prosecuting attorney announced he was no longer willing to prosecute this suit. The judge, for whatever reason, was fine with this. Despite sentence having been entered, he ordered Nelson Hackett be hence discharged and go thereof without delay. This does not explicitly say that he was re-enslaved or handed over to his owner. Now, what's going on? I think there was some deal making going on, as we'll see in the next slide. The next Monday, August 22, Bill Wallace, who's the daddy, transferred 2 enslaved men to his sons, or sort of. He sold Toby to Alfred and Jack to Willis for $1,000 each. The strange thing, though, is Bill set it up so he owned Jack and Toby until his death. Bill was in his early 60s, but he didn't die for another 20 years. In fact, he outlived both Alfred and Willis. It's hard to imagine why the promise of owning Jack or Toby in the future would be worth anything to his sons. After all, neither Jack nor Toby were women of childbearing age. They were not going to grow in number. They were not going to become, well, Toby might become more physically proud. Could it be that Nelson Hackett was worth $2,000? Did they trade him to their dad in exchange for 2 less troubling men? Was their dad bailing them out? He would take Hackett off their hands and cover their costs in retrieving him and sell Hackett to someone else or send him to Canada. With so many relatives and acquaintances already in Texas, it seems unnecessary to me to use Bill Wallace as an intermediary to send Hackett to Texas. My hunch is that the coincidence in time means something. Nelson Hackett does almost disappear from the record after this. Edward Cross beat Onesimus Evans' brother and was elected to Congress from Arkansas in October 1842. On December 2nd, an abolitionist named Lewis Tappan wrote Cross to ask for information about Hackett, because Tappan's brother had heard that he was taken to Arkansas, tried for stealing, and likely whipped, then delivered to his master, by whom he was sold to someone in Texas. On December 27, 1842, Cross reported to Tappan that Hackett was taken to Arkansas. Without trial, restored to the possession of his former master as a slave. He escaped again and was retaken, but finally escaped the 3rd time and has not been heard of since. In September 1844, 2 years later, a Van Buren paper reprinted a letter that accused the Washington County clerk, Ben Pearson, of copying and affixing the county seal of Washington to certain free papers on file. He gave them to a certain slave of Alfred Wallace, by which means he was enabled to make his escape. It's unclear whether this is referring to Hackett's escape in July 1841 or an escape in fall 1842. But either way, this is a remarkable claim. A few months later, in November 1844, the Wallaces got around to recording that mysterious deed of transfer, which they made just after Nelson Hackett's trial ended 2 years earlier. So white men like the Wallaces, the Balls, the Wilsons on the frontier were looking for the next big thing. If that meant investing in enslaved people, that's what they did. If it meant selling them, that's what investments are for. Slavery is not benign.
Thank you, Dr. Childs. Our final speaker is Dr. Carrie Banton. She is an associate professor of history and the director of African and African American Studies at the University of Arkansas. She earned her PhD in history at Vanderbilt University, and she's published, it's been about a year ago or more, a book with Cambridge University Press entitled More Auspicious Shores, Barbadian Migration, Blackness, and the Making of an African Republic. She's an expert on the African diaspora in the Atlantic world and is currently working on a project that actually looks at objects and placemaking and to kind of reveal the Back to Africa movement. Welcome, Dr. Banton.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you for to all who have shown up tonight, and to Mike and Lisa who have gone before me, covering much of the ground and providing much needed context for what I'm going to say. My task here is to really give you a perspective from, you know, the fugitives and the role that them and their fugitivity played in the transnational movement for emancipation and abolition. And this is particularly interesting and difficult thing because, you know, these are people who did not really leave, you know, much records behind. But, you know, as my advisor at Vanderbilt, Richard Blackett, noted, one way to get at what those who have left us with very few records, to get at what they think about the conditions in which they found themselves, is to look at what they did, is to look at where they went, and to look at, you know, the kinds of allies that they made, sometimes with the environment, sometimes with the very geography that, you know, they were escaping to. And so, you know, thinking about that, you know, and, you know, in light of what Dr. Pierce said earlier, you know, and thinking about the abolitionist, the fugitive slave law, and, you know, the eventual abolition of slavery, you know, we could think about, you know, in terms of these laws that gained their legitimacy by being consented to by those people who would wish to bind, these enslaved Africans who would wish to bind, then, you know, from the perspective of the enslaved, you know, then a lot of these laws were a failure. And that's what I hope to uncover tonight, give that perspective, the Black perspective, and to show what role Black people played by voting with their feet. Now, of course, slave owners were anxious to retrieve their slave property, as Lisa pointed out. You know, they employed numerous means to do so. For instance, on May 24th, 1796, the Pennsylvania Gazette recorded an advertisement offering $10 to any person who would apprehend only judge. Now I'll share my screen here. You all able to see that? Okay. Offering $10 to any person who would apprehend only Judd, an enslaved woman who had fled from President George Washington's Virginia plantation in Mount Vernon. The notice described her in detail as a, quote, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes and bushy hair, right? As well as, you know, articulated her skills at mending clothes, and that, quote, she may attempt to escape by water. And it is probable that she will attempt to pass as a free woman, and has it is said, wherewithal to pay her passage. She indeed did board a ship called the Nancy and made it to New Hampshire, where she later married a free Black sailor, although she herself was never freed by the Washingtons and may have remained a fugitive throughout her life. 2 years later, many years later in 1836, a group of Black women stormed a courtroom of Chief Justice Shaw to whisk two enslaved women, Eliza Small and Polly Ann Bates, to safety. The two had been freed on a writ of habeas corpus brought by the abolitionist lawyer Samuel Sewall and the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society after their master's agent had them apprehended aboard a ship. When the agent tried again to have them remanded under the provisions of the federal fugitive slave law, the women on Sewall's signal acted. The abolitionist right involving the women and the alleged dereliction of duty of Sheriff C.F. Sumner, a man of anti-slavery convictions and Sumner's father, led Northern conservatives to warn of a new phase in the abolitionist war against slavery. Following these and other famous cases, we could talk about the jury rescue on October 1, 1851, that involved the public rescue of a fugitive slave who had been arrested the same day in Syracuse, New York, during the Anti-Slavery Liberty Party State Convention. The escaped slave, William Henry, a 40-year-old Cooper from Missouri, called himself Jerry, right? The seizure, we could talk about the seizure of Anthony Burns, a fugitive slave from Virginia in Boston. Burns was the third escaped slave to be seized by that city, the second after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, a part of the Compromise of 1850. And in the wake of the unsuccessful attempt to rescue Burns, Sowell, along with many others, were arrested. A deputy guarding Burns was killed, and a charge of murder was leveled. Higginson and others was not arrested, and instead returned to Worcester and preached a sermon calling upon his fellow citizens to make Worcester, a Canada, a safe haven to the slave. And so this is the context in which Nelson Hackett, right, also made his fugitive escape from Fayetteville into Upper Canada. Yet the sheer preponderance of runaways created by Black people who were effectively trapped and caricatured by the law, only appearing as human in the presence of the law, and oftentimes, as you've seen by Professor Pierce and Lisa there, in the archives as merely fugitives or as property, right? And it is for this reason why we find so little else is known about Nelson Hackett, except for this harrowing tale of his escape from slavery. We know that in addition to that he was well dressed, he was intelligent, resourceful, and from his action that he desired to live as a free man. Now, what this minuscule, seemingly minuscule detail indeed reveals is a lot. It reveals the hidden politics among slaves, and it shows the importance of fugitivity in the broader struggle for abolition and emancipation. And this is shown over and over in documents after documents. For instance, in fugitive slave narratives are replete with these kinds of escape. On September 3rd in 1838, dressed in a sailor's uniform and carrying papers provided by a free Black seaman, Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist, escaped aboard a train bound for Maryland. And from there, he continued to New York and eventually to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he settled. And as he would remark to audiences later, quote, "I appear before you this evening as a thief and a robber. I stole this limb, this body from my master, and I ran off with them." These narratives and other writings in the 19th century largely were replete with Black people performing these contrived divisions of freedom. C. Riley Snorton in Black on Both Sides notes these instances that specifically involve fugitives undertaking cross-gender escape. For instance, in the Underground Railroad, William Still illustrated the nature of Black performativity that went into the Fugitive Act, right? Many of these runaways would enact a future freedom as they fled enslavement. And so Still would explore the escape of Clarissa Davis in 1854, the escape of Marion Weems of the District of Columbia in 1855, and the very famous transatlantic escape of Ellen Craft, who at first went by the alias William Johnson, and then William Craft of Georgia in 1848, and to point out how gender obfuscation undergirded performance during fugitive passage. Even Harriet Tubman herself, who came to embody the fugitivity of the Underground Railroad, once disguised herself as a bonneted woman in order to obstruct, a black man as a bonneted woman in order to obstruct his arrest and re-enslavement by Northern deputies. Harriet Jacobs described her own escape in 1842 in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, noting, quote, "I wore my sailor's clothes and I had blackened my face with charcoal. I passed several people whom I knew. The father of my children came so near that I brushed against his arm, but he had no idea who I was." So fugitives, you know, and employed a politics of performance that enabled them to have this kind of access to freedom, right? They achieved this kind of freedom through subterfuge, and as a result of that, this kind of freedom would be contingent on making continued pretensions, right? And according to Catherine McKittrick in her book, Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Geographies, the life and death of Black subjects was dependent on this kind of unmapped knowledge, while Roots gave people like Frederick Douglass the kind of invisible agency that they employed in these kinds of fugitive escape. Now, if a successful escape could have guaranteed the full benefits according to those who experienced liberty as a natural right, then perhaps such pretenses would not have persisted. The 19th century, the specter of runaways would come to define what Manisha Sinha described in her book of the same title as the slave's cause. In a burgeoning abolitionist movement, the drama surrounding the enslaved, unveiling the scars of bondage, would come to serve as a kind of cultural touchstone for thinking through the vagaries of Black performativity, fugitivity, and freedom. As running away in a white supremacist society specifically necessitated certain kinds of performances, it produced new possibilities as it pushed against limitations placed upon the enslaved. It inadvertently created a form of theater in which Black escapees attempted to subvert race and gender as they publicly performed a false identity that would be widely assumed to be that of a free person. Now, slaves ran away frequently, and in doing so displayed considerable political sophistication in discerning the social geography of slavery and freedom. Though the United States came to regard itself as the land of freedom, you know, they knew where to run, right? Slaves through fugitivity countered this narrative of the United States as the land of freedom, right? They knew that this land was bound up in slavery, and they operating on this premise, they saw it not as their home, or many parts of it as not as their home, right? So fugitivity would bring them to the liberated geographies in Spanish Florida, to Indian territory, to Haiti, right? Northern states also came to symbolize these free spaces for 19th century fugitives as well. In the same way, transnationally, the British West Indies was often valorized by African Americans as a space of fugitive freedom. According to Dennis Dickerson, African Americans praised Parliament for the manumissions of slaves in the West Indies and for suppressing the slave trade in Africa. African Americans praised congregations at the 1853 Canada Annual Conference for celebrating the annual 1st of August commemoration of the emancipation of slaves in the British West Indies. And at the 1854 Indiana Annual Conference, clergy rose occasionally to deliver special sermons and lectures in reference to the West India emancipation. Now, historians are currently also investigating the Underground Railroad into Mexico. Catherine McKittrick sees these different routes in the Underground Railroad as a kind of material and psychic mapping that contains signified secret knowledge and secret knowledge sharing contained around a community connected through abolitionism. And it is through these kind of secret knowledge sharing and signified secret knowledge that Black people created and shared amongst each other that they were able to affect abolitionism, not only within the US, but also transnationally. Enslaved people in the Deep South took these routes. They co-opted this knowledge, going through unforgiving forests, deserts, with the help of Mexican Americans and German immigrants and biracial Black and white couples living in the Rio Grande. Mexico obviously had abolished slavery in 1829. And so Black people, sailors, people moving around, as Julia Scott called it, a common wind, drew upon this kind of knowledge in their fugitivity. Black people also in their fugitivity drew upon marronage, right? Or the formation of these kind of runaway slave communities within the Deep South, in the Dismal Swamp, right? Where it was more common, than previously thought by scholars. Archaeologists are now discovering that Black people, were able to rough it out through these kind of very dangerous places. So they're making good their escape to Mexico, and they're going to the Caribbean. People like Ellen Croft are going to England, right? And the number of these fugitives, some of whom were, sometimes they were recaptured, we might never know. But what we know is that they became so ubiquitous that, we have this image in our popular imagination of the fugitive. And so ubiquitous was the runaway that Samuel Cartwright diagnosed slaves' tendency to run away as a disease known as drapetomania. Now, what is well documented are the many African Americans who fled into Canada. Today's historian count the number of fugitive slaves between 1830 and 1860 at about 150,000. Higher estimates, put it at, closer to, 160. And according to recent estimate that include runaway slaves who remain in the South and absconded temporary marronage, around 50,000 slaves ran away each year. To slaves in the antebellum United States, the Canadas virtually became synonymous with freedom. It became a haven. And though slavery was abolished through the British Empire only in 1833, Canadian law and custom had long since established emancipation by statute in 1793 in Upper Canada, and through legislation and through judicial decision in 1800 in Lower Canada. In 1840, for example, African Americans operating upon this knowledge who had run away to Canada formally organized themselves in churches and anti-slavery organization. And this jurisdiction, the first outside of the United States, would organize AME churches and conventions, meeting frequently with other colored conventions in Ontario and in the United States. The members were of these societies and organizations were slave escapees and expatriates, a lot of them from the Black communities in Philadelphia and Cincinnati and other cities where racial violence threatened their physical well-being. And they filled the churches in Toronto with, of 250 members sometimes, and populated congregations on the St. Catherine, Brantford circuits. In addition, citizenry would generally be counted on to take action if the law would not. In 1837, Samuel Mosley and Jesse Happy, fugitive slaves accused of horse theft by irate owners, were forcibly rescued by Upper Canadian judicial officials who were thereby prevented from extraditing them. Alexander Hemsley, for example, a slave born in Maryland, escaped to New Jersey. And though he was arrested and faced extradition, the New Jersey Supreme Court manumitted him to remain safe from slave catchers. Hemsley and his family migrated to St. Catherine, where he served until 1854 as a pastor among Canada AMEs. The freedoms African Americans enjoyed in Canada bred widespread admiration for the British, especially after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. And Dr. Dickinson, points out that at the 1853 Canada Annual Conference, it was resolved that among those gathered there, that, quote, "We have learned by long experience that the British government is the tried and true friend of the colored race." Now, equally important was the British goodwill towards Black people who had settled in Canada by extending, according to them, the hand of fellowship and throwing around us the arm of protection and providing a city of refuge for the bleeding slave, thus escaping the man-stealer. This resolution, Blacks should pledge loyalty to the Queen Victoria and swear allegiance to Her Majesty. So though the reception of Blacks to various parts of Canada was occasionally unfriendly, and at times British officials despaired of possible extradition and other international proceedings against fugitive slaves, African Americans still believed that greater security awaited them north of the border than in the United States. And McKittrick would again argue that these places essentially became Black geographies that are conceptually, politically, and materially, they're conceptually, political, and material in that they draw on and require engagement with the everydayness of spaces of Blackness. Now, yet beyond what can be gleaned from Hackett's fugitivity in the archive, or tracing the geography of freedom that he and thousands of others like him trace, Hackett's case was singular in the sensation that it caused. As Dr. Pierce pointed out earlier, the sensation around Hackett's case and what it would lead to in terms of, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty was indeed massive. Enslaved freedom seekers contributed to the breakdown of the comity between Southern and Northern states, and had a wide-ranging impact on the rise of sectional tensions. By September, after his disappearance in both Windsor and Chatham in Upper Canada, Wallace swore out depositions against Hackett for the theft of his horse, as well as the saddle, coat, and gold watch he had fled with. Other depositions were sworn out too in Upper Canada, as well as in Michigan. Wallace had Hackett arrested, as Dr. Pierce mentioned. He was arrested near Chatham and incarcerated in the Western District Jail at Windsor. And the charge of earlier rape that you see often in these kinds of cases was dismissed. After he was beaten, Hackett alleged he was beaten, and that's why he confessed to the theft. He later would deny them, claiming that it was because he was severely beaten over the head that he, during his interrogation, why he pled guilty to those charges. Now, in April, the American lawyer and abolitionist Charles Stewart would visit Nelson Hackett. Abolitionists hoped to use his case as the focal point in their campaign. And as Dr. Pierce pointed out, they would contact no other than, Charles Stewart, who would be on hand to examine Hackett's case, would contact none other than the wealthy American abolitionist, Quaker abolitionist, Louis Tappan of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1842. And so he wrote to him and said, "I have no doubt that Hackett was the victim of conspiracy among the Canadians and his captors. This restoration to captivity was invaluable to men, so offended by the escape of slaves, and who would thus be enabled to exhibit their power as overreaching even British protection. This, of course, paralyzes all effort at escape, as proven that there is no safety in no place. I believe the frontier authorities were to use and did use their influence with Sir Charles Bagot, and that they were to be well paid provided that the surrender was made. I suspect as participants in this, the justice, the jailer, Mr. Prince, and also perhaps Mr. Baby, the alleged counsel of the prisoner. I am certain Mr. Prince was active in this matter. So they discuss this idea amongst themselves, you know, and of course, as Dr. Pierce pointed out, it would lead to, you know, this putting pressure on Parliament to make significant moves, right? They soon, however, abandoned the idea because of the charges being brought that Hackett had stolen the watch, and that had come now to undermine the argument that he had merely stolen goods, and this would diminish the arguments for the case, right? They could find nothing out of order in the judicial proceeding, and so in Canada, Bagot would receive approval from the British Secretary of State on these same grounds to relinquish Hackett. Now, Hackett's case provoked, as I mentioned, public fury in Canada, which had, you know, as I established, had long been a haven for those who fled slavery in the United States. And many abolitionists indeed worried that the case would set a precedent by the American slaveocracy, and they would, you know, use it to seek the return of their human property by means of extradition requests. So Hackett's extradition, though, you know, provoking this kind of international furor, abolitionists, black and white, both in Canada and in the United States and in Britain, they, you know, gathered in terms of discussing Hackett's return to Fayetteville and the kinds of precedent that it would set. And they would invoke his case, Hackett by running away, and all of those who had run away before him, right, would come to occupy a massive space in the mind of these people discussing international law. They would invoke the case in the successful campaign to convince the British government to make the extradition of those fleeing slavery all but impossible. Of course, the Republican anti-slavery movement never abandoned the moral argument against slavery, but they fused it to this kind of material politics that Dr. Pierce had talked about earlier, about, you know, whether property and objects, whether they can actually be charged, right? They made the case successful, that what they called the slave power threatened not only moral principle, but with the actual livelihoods of Northern voters. They pointed to an antebellum power that dominated the federal government, that set its lands policy, its infrastructure policy, its trade policy, and all sorts of economic structures that favored the slaveholding regime and undermined the material well-being of Northerners from Michigan to Pennsylvania to Maine. And so the Republicans holding up Hackett's case and fugitives like him were able to make that case and connect it to the criminality and sin of slavery. And so this kind of moral fusion with the kind of, you know, the issue around Hackett's case inspired not just a handful of abolitionists in the United States and in Canada, but other people, you know, workers, ordinary people in the North, small farmers as well. Ultimately, the return of Hackett to his owner, who also went to, the return of Hackett to his owner, you know, obviously, though it went counter to Canadian traditions regarding fugitive slaves, as I mentioned, previous extradition laws did not mention escaped slaves. But as a consequence of the Hackett case, Tappan and Louis Tappan and other abolitionists like him, leading the American abolitionist effort, amended the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And as Dr. Pierce pointed out, Article 10, specifically of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, approved by the British government, carefully tried to curtail the extradition of criminals and thus sought to more effectively protect fugitive slaves from the automatic surrender to their owners. So Black people who were fugitives by running away, by voting with their feet, by seeing the geography of these places as their ally, would come to bring a lot to bear on these kinds of international agreements. And even though we don't see them in the written record as having any kind of impact, by looking, you know, at the records in another way, we can register their impact, you know, by rethinking how we traditionally think about how we approach history and its methodology. So I will stop there for now. I forgot to show you all Samuel Cartwright and his drapetomania psychiatric diagnosis for runaway slaves, but I'll stop there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Banton. Thanks, everyone. We're going to move on to the question portion of our session, our program today, and Trish Starks is going to stop the recording.